My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Really interesting Substack about the Greater Israel Project. I'm just going to pull it up here because whenever I speak to you, it's like I need to have huge amounts of notes because you're like this wealth of information and I can't remember everything. But let's just quickly get the macro picture. You're essentially arguing, if I'm correct, that the Greater Israel Project is hindering the
I think that is undeniable.
It's causing it to slow down.
Is that correct? Israel idea, and I think that it's always been based upon a concept of creating a more divided Eurasian landmass. It goes back well over a century, as far as the British Empire looking upon this very strategic geographical zone on the world map and seeing that this is where the civilizations of the world tend to intersect. And it has been known for millennia that whoever can control this region can control the general ability to prevent the dangerous convergence of civilizational forces. Persia, Asia, China, Russia, Africa, Europe, in this very strategic pivot zone. So if you're somebody who really loves humanity and cares about freedom and the future and avoiding war, then this region is extremely important for a different set of reasons, because it is the core of the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road of the Han Dynasty, and that was revived under the Tang Dynasty, and that played such a big role with the Muslim, Carolingian, Christian, Jewish, Chinese convergence of collaboration in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. During the Tang Dynasty, that was, we saw people like Harun al-Rashid working the head of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Muslim world, in Baghdad, working with Jews on bringing together scientists and poets at the houses of wisdom, as well as Charlemagne and his children, who were also sending envoys of Christians to share and develop a better understanding of their neighbors instead of going into crusading wars. So for the good, it's been a very important place and could still yet be again, I think, with the Chinese having revived the Silk Road agenda in the 21st century. And I think that a lot of the enemies of that outlook are intent on lighting the thing on fire and instead promoting a much more bigoted, much more dangerous, imperial, Cecil Rhodian inspired vision of a greater ethno-state of Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates, as Theodor Herzl had pointed out, as Herzl himself was an admirer of Cecil Rhodes and was writing letters to Rhodes celebrating how successful Rhodes was as an exemplar in subduing the dark savages that had been living there in a troublesome way in South Africa. And that was something he wanted to bring back into the Middle East for his envisioned new Zionist state.
I was, as you know, in China for almost a month last year, and I traveled across from the east to the west with Carl Zar and Pepe Escobar and a few others, going to actually the historic Silk Road Trail, as it were. We went to Urumqi and Kashgar, which is pretty much on the border of Afghanistan, and it really is something to behold. Very special. It's difficult to put into words. You need to kind of go there and experience the intense history. And only when you're there do you realize how far back this trade route goes. I say trade route. I know it was so much more than that, but and the fact that China is trying to rebuild it in sort of a 21st century way is extremely visible when you are in Xinjiang. I don't know why I'm telling you that, but it just is it's a beautiful part of history.
As well. It's most an people that blind spot that's been placed don't even know in the Western zeitgeist by design. It should be something that we should all understand. We should know its history. We should see how it's already, in its short time that it's been revived, has transformed so many lives and created so many foundations of potential for collaboration and for peace that, since Xi Jinping just announced it in September of 2013, and it really has taken on a really brilliant life of its own and has served as sort of the glue that gives, I think, vitality and substance to the multipolar, the better, healthier multipolar outlook. I say healthier because there is a sicker, evil version of multipolarity as well that I think everybody watching your show has become aware of, which also goes back quite some time, but is founded on a much more Orwellian notion of jurisdictional fascist states or regional areas to be managed by a feudal technocracy of some sort. That would be a sicker version, but I think the healthier version that has this deeper historical precedent was unveiled in 2013. Of course, Russia, China, India, Iran, especially Iran, had created a foundational block around which the Shanghai Cooperation was created. If this is already now well over 20 years ago, and the BRICS also grew out of this, but by themselves without the type of project, the action, just simply a treaties of alliance on paper is not adequate to give it vitality. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, which entails thousands of small projects, medium-sized projects, mega-scale projects with arteries, high-speed rail, as well as conventional rail, roads, and new development corridors, energy corridors, water projects, stretching all the way from the east coast of China on the Pacific, all the way through the Middle East, as well as with branches through Mongolia into Russia, pipelines as well down into Europe, and even southern corridors too, have been presented, have been shaping lives, uplifting people from poverty and squalor, and have been really creating, I think, what Zbigniew Brzezinski had outlined in 1997 in his grand chessboard as the only possible threat to his New World Order fantasy that had just been celebrated in 1992 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said only a unlikely but possible convergence of Russia, China, and Iran might provide together a threat to our New World Order. And that is exactly what has manifested in so many ways. And of course, China had been working very, very hard, along with the Russians, to ensure that al-Qaeda would not be victorious in Syria, since Syria was also a major artery of the ancient Silk Road and should be again. Of course, also Iraq and other regions of that area, which were burnt and lit on fire, especially after 9/11, but more recently with the emergence or the imposition of Giuliani, the former head of ISIS in Syria, who's been made president, has really put a major block. Even Lebanon. Oh, most certainly. So, yes, absolutely. So all of this has been lighting the Silk Road on fire, or at least the hoped for stability that is required for the types of long-term 5, 10, 20-year, 50-year thinking that the Silk Road planning requires. That stability is not being permitted in this vital area, including in Lebanon, where Israel has just invaded. Of course, Israel, again, when you look at the greater Israel map, those who believe at least in this greater Israel outline see a land much bigger than the current one, and that involves the purging of all of those Arabs living both in the Gaza, as well as in West Bank, as well as in Lebanon, but even much more broadly beyond that, into borders that take up most of Iraq, most of Syria, some of Saudi Arabia. A big chunk of Egypt must be removed from the Egyptians for this desired covenant with God thousands of years back to be fulfilled, and some believe that now is that time, and China's Belt and Road would not benefit thereby if this does proceed forward.
All right, Matt,
I'm speaking about an area
about Greater Israel.
As Herzl,
what are you speaking about?
Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism and himself a kind of radical, misanthropic he didn't even like the Jews. He believed that they should all be forced converted into Catholicism, but he also loved anti-Semitism and even celebrated how useful having the anti-Semitic fervor was throughout Europe, saying what a great boon this is for the cause of Zionism, since it's making life very uncomfortable for the expat Jews living across Europe and Russia, and how wonderful it is that they now finally are getting in their heads that they're not welcome and want to leave. So he'd written that it is believed that this promised land must extend from the Nile to the Euphrates as a zone of influence. You had many Kabbalistic figures, not the least important of which being a rabbi by the name of Abraham Isaac Kook, Kook, who was the British selection for the chief Ashkenaz rabbi of British Mandate Palestine, where the British were able to gain control of that region with the French after or during World War II. The Sykes-Picot Agreement showcased to the world what this agreement was to carve up that region with the plan of turning British Mandate Palestine into an eventual ethno-nationalist state, as outlined by Lord Balfour, as well as Lord Milner, Leo Amory, Lloyd George, who all had a hand in playing, along with Walter Rothschild, who all had a hand in drafting the Balfour Accords. And Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, who was very influential. He died in 1935. He was installed by the British in 1919, was a radical follower or believer and promoter of Greater Israel. And he even said, got a little quote here that I'll just even read just to get a sense of his importance and what he was thinking. But he said that as a Kabbalist, the truth concerning the land is revealed in Kabbalah. Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, militates for life in the land of Israel. Rationalistic approaches to Judaism place no special value on the land of Israel. That is, anybody who is not a believer in his particular brand of Zionism. In wars, national characters crystallize. Israel as the universal reflection of mankind benefits thereby. So Israel benefits through wars because it crystallizes the national character of a people. Only in war, though. The heels of Messiah follow upon world conflagration. So basically, he's presuming that at this moment that we can create this idealized situation, which also involves the reconstruction of a certain temple that had been destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. At the hour of the downfall of Western civilization, Israel is called upon to fulfill its divine mission by providing the spiritual basis for the New World Order, he says in 1935. And this book was disgusting, but it outlined it inspired several generations of yeshivas, and all of the creators of the radical legalist settler movement that really sprung into high gear after the Six-Day War in 1968, basically settling illegally in areas that were not Israel. They were all followers of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook. He worked also very closely with Jabotinsky, who was another believer in Greater Israel. Jabotinsky's personal secretary was the father of Benjamin Netanyahu, as we all know. And this is something which today, if you look at the patches of the different forces within the Israeli Special Forces, there are official military patches celebrating Greater Israel it's outlined directly on the map. And I'd say in my assessment, I think it has a lot to do with the similarity of the map of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. There have been, yeah, I don't think that's a coincidence. That was the period that the Jews were in captivity for about 70 years.
That. Looks very similar.
Being screwed with basically by their captors, the Babylonian high priests took a lot of. I thought it was 70 for some reason is what's in my head. I could
hold on, Matt. Was it?
Google that
are you
right
sure
now
it was
and
70 years?
find
Wasn't
out
it
for you?
40 years?
That's not hard.
I can't remember, but I mean, it's just, I don't think it's all that important.
It says here,
but someone is going to say
48 years. You were correct.
His history.
So I guess I was calculating for some inflation there. I was inflating upwards for, I'm in Canada.
Well, I wasn't correct, but I was closer.
Our dollar in time isn't worth as much. So, yeah, I think that when you
inflation.
look at those, the idea of reconstituting Babylon, specifically with the intention of trying to fulfill prophecy, there have been, unfortunately, social engineers, religious engineers at the highest echelons of the high priesthoods that have been latched on like a parasite to humanity, trying to convince us at various times to commit mass collective suicide as chess pieces on this great game board, whether it was the Crusades 1,000 years ago that was configured in order to break and destroy any possible emergence.
So everything is different now because we had a little breakage. I'm trying to think now, what was your last line before you broke off?
That notion of the idea of reconstituting ancient Babylon in order to fulfill certain books that have been considered canonical, especially I'm thinking about the book of Revelation. So the idea that Babylon must somehow be reconstituted in order to inaugurate or invoke, even if we want to use this type of more sorcery oriented language, which is how I see a lot of these religious engineers who have been playing mankind like a fiddle for so long, is they use prophecy, whether it's of a Christian, a Jewish, a Muslim, a Zoroastrian, an Egyptian, a Coptic, there's different types of spin and different types of eschatologies that have been used by high priesthoods over the years, but the effect is always the same thing: to create cryptic, ambiguous language, often uttered by some oracle, a Sibyllian prophetess, a high priestess, an oracle, that is then highly interpretive. So it is something that could be the allegorical language which describes the end times, often with a millennialist bent to it, that could be applied to almost any context of a crisis moment, whereby people get more crazy, they get more despair-ridden, they get more fearful, and thus more inclined to join end times cults. And it thus abolishes our free will, our ability to discern right from wrong, to see that something bad is happening, and instead of correcting that bad orientation, as I think mature humans do, those who are soft-minded enough to tend to fall prey to these types of manipulations will instead believe that this evil thing that we're moving towards, whether it was the bloodbath ritual of the crusades that went on for centuries, is a necessary thing to fulfill God's will, that God demands evil, that he demands blood in order for some form of purity to emerge out of the chaos. And that destruction of free will is something that benefits a ruling oligarchy that doesn't like human beings thinking as sovereign beings, creatively problem solving. They don't like that. So I think that the idea of reconstituting this idea of Babylon itself in some way, where, of course, the idea of Mystery Babylon has been a curiosity of the last 2,000 years. How do we interpret, is the debate of every century of theologians. How do we interpret the language of the Scarlet Woman, of the Whore of Babylon, of what is this Mystery Babylon? Where is it? And I think that when I look at those leading British imperial grand strategists around Lord Palmerston, around Lord Shaftesbury, the ironic godfather of modern Zionism, is a British imperial Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper. If I look at what they were doing and who they were working with when they were crafting things like the Palestinian Exploration Fund, along with Sir Charles Warren and the King Edward VII in the 1860s, 1862, they were directly sent down to the region of Palestine, partially in order to excavate Solomon's Temple. That's where modern biblical archaeology comes from. These were people who were very closely aligned with the Darbyites of the Plymouth Brethren that had also emerged around the same period of the 1830s, 1840s, to promote an idea that in order to actualize end times, we needed to bring the Jews of the world, convince them all to just go and live in the desert and then reconquer Zion. Schofield was very much influenced by the teachings of Darby, as was Shaftesbury. And not only did Darby popularize this idea of rapture, interpreting such scriptures or such writings of Paul in Thessalonians as though a rapture of the true believers would happen, who would not have to suffer the 7 years of tribulation. He originated that notion, which Schofield adopted, which was the Moody Bible College was entirely founded upon the Darbyite interpretation, and so were many the entire Pentecostalist movement that was created at the early 1900s was also entirely Darbyite. But what they were doing as well, in tandem with these imperialists around Charles Warren, that gave rise to the Grand Lodge, or what was it called? The Quatuor Coronati Lodge, the Freemasonic Grand Research Lodge that grew out of the Palestinian Exploration Fund. They were also looking for, where do they plot out, where do they say Jerusalem was, the city around the seven hills, because certain conditions had to be met geographically in order for the wording found within Revelations to be fulfilled. And the actual evidence that pointed to the existence of the ancient Jerusalem being in a certain location near two hills was not satisfactory to those who wanted to manipulate the data and act upon this prophecy. And so Charles Warren, as well as members of the New Templar German order that was founded in 1861, the same year that the Palestinian Exploration Fund was set up by the British, and both worked very closely together in Palestine. They ensured that it would be this particular area that did have seven hills around it that became the consensus around which these imperialists said, okay, we're going to make it here, because that was needed in order to fulfill the book of Revelations. And so the idea of Mystery Babylon, I think, was very much tied to that area that the Jews would be convinced to live in, that would grow in scope and scale to mimic the same size of the ancient Babylon of
Yep. Matt, sorry, this is a segue and probably has nothing to do with this conversation, but I heard somewhere that in the 90s, a young German, or shall we say Austrian, by the name of Adolf Hitler, he knew about this also. Do you know anything about that?
Yes. So Hitler, I'm actually producing a documentary with Cynthia right now, and indeed this will go through some of that story. Hitler went to school, primary school in Germany, in Austria.
It's a mistake that we all make.
Right. The tongue there. But he went to a school in a monastery, it doubled as a monastery, and it was run by Cistercian monks, of which one lecturer there was Lanz von Liebenfels, who reconstituted the German New Templar Order as an offshoot of the Theosophists in 1907. The founder and the headmaster of the school was himself a member of the New Templars that had settled. That was the first major German colonization program in 1867. So they moved in fully to Palestine and began to set up colonies with the British that they were always planning with the idea of bringing in the Messiah, of setting up this land in order to be the Babylon that would then usher in and welcome in the Messiah to inaugurate this new age, which I believe Hitler later on, I mean, there were swastikas that are still found today on this very school whose name I'm forgetting because I will have it in my upcoming book as well.
No, it wasn't part of the conversation, I know.
No, you're absolutely correct. And the Nazis in the high command of the NRSS were absolutely committed to the idea of building up Jewish ethno-state. And that's why Hitler was so enthusiastic, along with Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of the Jewish problem of Europe, was so enthusiastic about the Havara Agreement of 1933. As soon as the Germans had, carried out their operation to successfully achieve the Enabling Acts and to eliminate all of their opposition within Germany, the first thing that they did is they had a meeting with the British Empire and said, hey, let's get the Jews to the Middle East. And the Havara Agreement that was celebrated with German minted coins. No, it's fine. So the Havara Agreement coins were celebrated by the British, by the Germans with coins with swastikas and stars of David on either side. And that ensured that over 70,000 Jews would be extracted from Germany and Europe more broadly and sent in, all expenses paid, into Palestine, as part of what Eichmann even had said he was adamant should be the future of those people, which is why Eichmann was also studying Hebrew so that he could practice Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, basically practical magic of a certain sort, and said that, he would, if he were born a Jew, be the most ardent Zionist, and he could imagine being nothing else on his last interview in 1961. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The overlap of the occult inner sanctum of New Templars, the Templars themselves, just to say, were an initiatory chivalric order, but actually had a pagan Mithraic inner core that was seated in the early days of the First Crusades, with the idea, as Albert Pike had even said of the Templars, of rebuilding Solomon's Temple for the third time and building up the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was a Crusader-managed kingdom that lasted for a little over 2 centuries, as the foundation of a new millennial age, which I think the Nazis thought of as the Age of Horus, as a new 1,000-year Reich that would come into being, and that would be inaugurated by a purgative period of blood loss, of violence, and out of those ashes, a new order would emerge.
Okay, so it's taken quite a long time for us to get to why Greater Israel is hindering multipolarity. Now, in your article, you mentioned a few strategies.
Yes, certainly. Well, number one, there are two aspects there are two things that have to really work for multipolarity in the healthiest sense of the term to be successful. One is the international north-south transportation corridor that was first inaugurated in 2000 by Russia, India, and Iran. And that involves something like 13 other countries that would benefit immensely by these rail corridors, ports, and other things that would move from the far north of Russia down into India, with ports in the south of Iran. That took on major life after 2018, 2019, and has since been destabilized quite a bit in a variety of ways, not just through Syria, but also through manipulations in the corridor the energy and rail corridors in Armenia and Azerbaijan that has recently been an important little area was taken over by the US, and which has really put into jeopardy a big important artery of that. Iran's stability is very important. Of course, Iran provides a stabilizing influence both in beating back the US-sponsored Al-Qaeda and Islamist Salafist organizations that had been induced to spread since 9/11 especially. Actually really going back to the days of Zbigniew Brzezinski first launching Operation Cyclone in 1979. Al-Qaeda grew out of that U.S.-funded, especially through U.S. proxies in Saudi Arabia and then Pakistan 45 years ago, radicalizing madrasas that weaponized Islam in order to break the Soviet Union and suck them into their own Vietnam War. But the current incarnation of modern Salafism grew out in many ways of that movement and continued to enjoy the support, whether it was in Libya, Mali, Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood played a very big role in also growing these operations sponsored by the U.S. Iran had been, again, playing a very important role at subduing, at putting down these operations, which if they are taken out, then I think that the Arab world as a whole will be more easily lit on fire as these Islamic Caliphate obsessed agencies, which have, I can't emphasize this enough, which have enjoyed the support logistically, financially, and otherwise of Anglo-American intelligence, will simply grow and grow and grow. Again, that will not be favorable to the economic climate needed to build up the type of international north-south transportation corridor or Belt and Road Initiative, which is so vitally important. I think there's other elements too. As far as the Greater Israel idea, there's recently been over July of last year, a law passed in the Knesset of Israel, allowing for Israel to simply seize and annex the West Bank. That's something that is, I believe, high up on the agenda, but also Gaza is nearly completely wiped out. Despite even all of the nice talk of the Board of Peace, there's no idea there whatsoever about how to actually heal. I don't know if you can heal from the type of trauma and evil that has been done to the people who have been living in the Gaza, but even before the October 7th moment was unleashed as what I believe to be an inside job, there was already a long recognition of the vast recoverable oil reserves off the coast of Gaza, of which 1.7 billion recoverable barrels had been already identified by the U.S. Department of the Interior in 2010. Originally, it was some British companies that identified these reserves. Yasser Arafat was very enthusiastic about developing a strategy to really start harnessing what is in Gaza's territorial rights to access and to use for the benefit of the people living in this area. Was this, 122 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas is estimated to be in this area, which the Israeli intelligence had produced policy papers, as I outlined in that new article you just cited that I published. The Israeli intelligence had leaked documents where these policy papers that were leaked outlined their view of the need to eliminate the Gazans, extract them, and put them into the Sinai Peninsula so that Israel could have control of this region and have Israel become an energy powerhouse that would feed back into the greater Israel metropolis, this cosmopolitan sort of macro empire that some wished to see build. That also requires the downfall of Lebanon. Israel is, after all, trying to pick a fight and has invaded Lebanon already. They've attacked leaders of a major force within the Iraqi military leadership, which could easily spark yet another front that could fall out of control. And I think the ultimate idea would be the downfall of Iran itself, which is what the clean break doctrine outlined by the neocons around Victoria Nuland's brother-in-law, Donald Kagan, as well as Richard Pearl, first put forth for Benjamin Netanyahu in 1997. The clean break doctrine outlined for a push towards regime change in all of the Arab nations that had been doing a very good job at beating back radical fundamentalist Islam in favor of a more healthy, grounded idea of economic development, which included in that list Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran was the major trophy to be destroyed in the clean break doctrine, which has always been, I think, obsessing. And they know that if they can get rid of Iran by any way possible, then greater Israel, as well as radical Salafism, will have no more resistance that would be useful.
I mean, as far as I understand, Iran is one of the very few quote unquote sovereign countries left in that region. Most of those countries have aligned with Israeli interests.
Yeah, and there's a number of data points that would back up what you just said from the standpoint of Iran's ability to maintain a national bank, not privatized, as so many other nations of the world have seen their private central banks imposed upon them as entities above the power of the nation state and acting on the benefit of an unelected financier oligarchy. I think, Iran, China, North Korea, and Venezuela are among the few countries. There might be one or two that I'm not thinking about that still have an actual national bank under the jurisdiction of the powers of the republic itself. It has survived and even found a way to build up an indigenous manufacturing cycle over decades and decades of being the most sanctioned country in the world, suffering decades of economic war and economic terrorism by the United States and their allies around the IMF and World Bank. So they've been, with every attempt to cripple and destroy Iran, they've been able to still find a way to build up their own native industrial base, their energy systems, as well as they're becoming a pioneer in nuclear science, including medical isotope science and nuclear science more generally. And they've done it with their strategic allies. So they've done so much to demonstrate what a thorn that they are for those fanatical utopians who wish to create some sort of a weird global centralized control grid founded upon depopulation and divide to conquer strategies. That there's much more to say about what they've done for the benefit of their people and to demonstrate the power of the sovereign nation state when it actually does act in accordance with natural law. There's so many things that they've done that really demonstrate in my mind that, in opposition to those who would accuse Iran of being an enemy agency that's been secretively trying to build an atomic bomb, I've seen no evidence of the sort. I've seen no evidence that they represent the city of London in the Middle East, as some alternative media commentators I've heard have stated without proof. I've seen no evidence that anything but what British intelligence through MI6, Nicholas Langham, who is in charge of the Iran desk for MI6, bragged that he had successfully introduced the narrative that Iran has a nuclear weapons program that had first been initiated by Benjamin Netanyahu in the 1990s. They're always 3 months away and always have been for the last 40 years. He bragged openly and was caught. And then it was Israeli intelligence that somehow found the information in 2018, 12 days before the sunset clause of the nuclear deal with America was supposed to pass, that Netanyahu gave a P.T. Barnum press conference showcasing how his intrepid Mossad found in an abandoned warehouse in Tehran thousands, half a ton of documents proving this secret nuclear weapons program. And none of it was ever true. You actually look at, for any people who actually read those documents that he said proved it conclusively, they noted that there was nothing of the sort. These documents merely dealt with a period from 1997 to 2003 before the Iranian fatwa was passed banning any type of weapon of mass destruction, and didn't even prove that even then there was anything of the sort. So do it.
But I mean, so what, technically? So what if Iran does have nuclear weapons? Israel clearly has nuclear weapons. It won't say how many though, because of what they call the Samson. What's that self-defense?
Samson doctrine. Yeah.
And the US has got loads of nuclear warheads, but Iran isn't allowed any.
The hypocrisy is astounding. And on top of that, not only does Israel have a program, like you said, to actually use it in any type of moment where they should feel mortally threatened, to not only obliterate everybody around them, including their allies, but themselves as well, following in the footsteps of of Samson, and that certain Kabbalists believe is part of this ritual. And I would say, when you look at those most radical black sorcerers, the black magicians in the esoteric section of the Zionist elite, they themselves don't live in Israel. The Rothschilds never lived in Israel. They don't live in the area that you intend to light on fire. They are more than happy, though, to create a mass sacrifice, which they believe as a blood sacrifice would be needed to usher in the Messiah. In some case, some believe for the first time, some believe for the second time, whether you're a Darbyite or whether you're a Netanyahu lover. The point being, though, is they all believe in the same, something that will result in the same effect. So we are in, the U.S. has actually dropped bombs on defeated Japan and have a strategic doctrine in place that they've had for many years for limited nuclear war that they believe this has been generated by Rand Corporation in the 1950s and has been adopted by U.S. foreign grand strategies since Zbigniew Brzezinski to actually allow for limited nuclear war that might dispose of certain American allies that are disposable, but ultimately that would result in outcomes that would have adequate collateral damage. You know, if 90% of the population of the world dies, so be it. At least that 10% would be us and not our peer competitors that must be destroyed even more than we destroy ourselves. And we're in that level of psychopathy. So you're right to say that Iran shouldn't have them is also a bit of a trapping, on top of the fact that they don't, or there's no evidence that they do, and that every evidence that has been put forth has been founded on fraud and lies. But even if they did, as you pointed out, it still wouldn't be a bad deal because everybody else, so many other people.
I'm not saying, but hold on, I'm not saying that everybody should have them. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. But
that they do.
I'm pointing out the double standard.
Mm-hmm. You're right. No, I agree.
We know what America's position on the greater Israel is. I mean, America wants to make Israel greater again. What is China's position on greater Israel?
China and I'll throw in Russia too. So I'll throw in both of those countries because they both have 25-year strategic comprehensive partnership pacts with Iran. First up, there has been efforts made by the Russians to try to broker a dialogue amongst factions within the rabbinical community of Judaism to discuss building Solomon's temple, which is part of this greater Israel idea. You have to see that as part of the broader formula. But to build it in such a way that it could coexist next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, because certain eschatologists and fanatics who want to do this believe that Solomon's temple exists somehow directly on the location of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is actually not even true. The evidence for that is very flimsy, but they've really got a consensus that that mosque must be destroyed for the temple to then be rebuilt at that location, which, of course, third most holy site for all of the Muslims. That's a recipe for multi-generational disaster again. So they had been trying up until 2009. I know that there were conferences to try to say, hey, why don't we just have these things exist together? The Jews can have their temple. The Muslims can have the Al-Aqsa. They can pray together. They can live together. Why do you have to blow things up? I think that was like, a creative way to approach it. But of course, any type of groupings in Israel that wanted that are nowhere near political power at this point. The Yitzhak Rabin, Yossi Beilin networks are far removed. Yitzhak himself had been killed not by an Iranian, but by a radical Zionist in 1995, making way for Netanyahu. And Yossi Beilin, his justice minister, has long since passed. So those factions are not even near power. So that's demoralizing. China has not openly, their approach is to play a much more laid back diplomatic posture. What China tries to do is simply present necessary and good ideas to make people's lives better and make business happen, to make money that meets what they believe is the self-interest of those business partners in different countries that they're trying to shake out of their stupidity. So they present something, they offer to fund it, to make it very easy to facilitate the building of rail, of roads, of other things that are going to stimulate the economy, create a condition where people let go of their baggage with their neighbors that they've been at war with for centuries and generations. And sometimes it works. Sometimes when it applies radical ideology of a religious bent, it doesn't work so well. China had been trying very hard to offer different economic incentives to Israel to take part in the Belt and Road Initiative over the past 12, 13 years. There's been limited contracts to build little subways, little bits of infrastructure in piecemeal form here and there that the Israelis permitted, but nothing. Israel would not even consider getting on board with the Belt and Road Initiative. Not even once was that seriously entertained by any leaders in Israel itself. Though I think many Jews who live there who are not in political power do recognize that it is much more preferable to build things like that and build with their neighbors and bring back a two-state solution concept that Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat had died fighting for. But again, they're not in political power. So China, I think, is taking a very patient look. They're trying not to get enmeshed in it. They do have a nuclear arsenal, as does Russia. They know how easy it would be to trigger a chain reaction, which could result in them getting enmeshed to defend and get really implicated in a kinetic war that might activate in a number of ways their nuclear response. And that would then, if that begins, that is something that wouldn't end. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. That could be the extermination of civilization as we know it for many centuries and maybe longer. So they're trying to walk very carefully right now, I think, and simply, I wish. I get frustrated that sometimes China isn't using their clout and power in a way that I would like to see more forcefully, calling out liars and evildoers. But I mean, I kind of get it when the stakes are so high. I guess I understand it to a certain extent.
Isn't it because China is extremely pragmatic?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they don't get sucked into ideological drama. That's part of their policy is stay far away from any type of ideological drama and baggage in any of the countries that you're going to be engaging with, and deal with pure business, dry, pragmatic, make it happen. If that's a country that has a culture of corruption to get things done, then whatever, you go there, you pass your briefcases along to get the contract signed, but you build the dam. You build the bridge, you get the contract signed to get things done, whatever the case may be. And again, with fanatical, radical, religious ideology that doesn't care about self-interest. See, this is the thing. So China's approach works to the degree that you're dealing with people who have some connection to some objective self-interest. When you're dealing with end times eschatologists, they don't think mass death of themselves and their own people is necessarily all that bad. It's not about money. It's not about making things better, because they believe that God wants to make things worse. That's actually part of why we should believe in God, because God wants to make things really worse. And so they might even see the types of ideas that China offers as obstructive to God's will, because it makes things better. It brings you further away from the objective of getting that world conflagration that Abraham Isaac Kook had called for to usher in the New World Order.
Okay. How much of the greater Israel has been achieved thus far?
A fraction of what is desired. Again, but I with the current accelerated crisis that is being inflamed, I could see it moving much quicker. Well, everyone can.
Let me stop you there, because Vanessa Beeley makes the argument that it's a lot further along than we think. The geographical borders are less important than the actual, not geographical, the metaphysical borders are further. If you look at what's happened to Syria, for example, IDF have got free range.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, she's right, and it's a little jarring. You're correct that the IDF have free range. They can move within Syria at their will. They can even insert themselves.
I said free range. I mean free reign.
Yeah. Okay. I was going with your language, but yeah. But in a certain sense, true. They do have they can literally move. They do have a certain free range within Syria as well. They can move rather freely. They've got access to entry points into Lebanon from Syria. Additionally, yeah, the integration of Israeli technology, Israeli industrial power, surveillance power with
The UAE is in the pockets of Israel, for example.
UAE is very high. Israel's control over water desalination infrastructure across the entire Middle East, which is so vital for the lives of millions and millions of people across the Middle East, is largely monopolized, except for Iran. But most of it is monopolized by Israeli tech companies that also operate through the UAE. Again, Israeli intelligence is heavily embedded, heavily enmeshed within many of these Gulf states that have been brought into the Abraham Accords. So, I hate to say it, but I do think that Vanessa is correct in that sense, that they are more advanced than many, including myself, would like to admit.
And is it true that Israel itself hasn't officially declared its own borders for this reason?
They want to keep their options very, very fluid and flexible. As I pointed out, they just passed an edict giving themselves the right to annex the West Bank whenever they should see fit, as well as portions of Lebanon and Jordan, I should say. They have gone out of their way to not put any constraints on themselves. At the same measure, what I would also say is that when I look at things like the Board of Peace and those who have been promoting it, which include, those members on the executive board like Sir Tony Blair. The man is a member of the order. He's a Knight of the Order of the Garter, the most elite, high-end, top chivalric order of the British Empire, created in 1348 as part of an inauguration of what became the 100 Years' War, of permanent bloodbath war between Christians in Europe, as well as the Black Plague, which was also invoked that very same year in the initiation of the breakdown of the banking system of the entire European community. That was 1348, all that. So that Order of the Garter that Tony Blair is an initiative that was, in my mind, a reemergence of the Knights of Solomon's Temple, the Knights Templar, that went underground and reemerged a few decades after they were forced to go underground in the form. One of their iterations was the Order of the Garter, which has been obsessed with rebuilding Solomon's Temple, as Albert Pike had put forth in his Morals and Dogma, and many other scholars had also acknowledged that was true, as part of a initiation in their mind of a new world order founded upon a reemergence, a revival of the ancient high priesthood that would then normalize things like human sacrifice as part of a new sacrament, a holy sacrament of a merging of the profane and the sacred that is part of this millennialist gambit. So the fact that you have many people like Pete Hegseth, also a radical Templar revivalist who's even got the Templar Kingdom of Jerusalem cross tattooed on his chest firmly and has given speeches in Israel in 2017, calling for the rebuilding of the Solomon's Temple as the purpose of his life's mission. I don't think that they're necessarily thinking of it from the standpoint of how it will benefit the Jews. I think they're thinking about it from the standpoint more of the Templars, who are more than happy to ritualistically murder everybody and anything in order to, including the Jews, who did get completely brutalized throughout the Crusades, in order to bring about their idea of this new age of what I think Crowley being Baphomet. That's how he called himself in the Argentum Astrum Lodge and the Ordo Templi Orientis. He created a Templar order for himself and named himself Baphomet, the androgynous demon god worshipped by the Templars, says Eliphas Levi. And, these people do think of a restoration and expansion. They don't think that the Kingdom of Jerusalem should have ever ended in 1291 at the Battle of Acre versus Saladin. They don't think that should have happened. That was a mistake that they've been trying to correct now for a long time. And I think that they ultimately want, this Gaza Board of Peace to turn into something that would be post-Jewish, post-Muslim in that area and actually be the seat around which their idea of an antichrist would emerge. I think that they actually want that in my research. That's where it's leading my mind. And I think that the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the reputed region or the geographical area where Jesus was killed on the cross, has been at the heart of both the Crusades, the idea of getting revenge for the Arabs who had damaged the Holy Sepulchre before the Crusades. That was part of what initiated the Crusades, was getting revenge and building that back up again. And it's still there today with a certain military order, 1,000 strong, that exists even now, controlling many of the educational resources of kids living all across the Middle East, especially in the Gaza, whose manuals, whose training books, whose school books are run, whose teachers are trained by the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, which is still there, which uses as its flag, its banner, the flag of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So again, I think that's also in play, and not a lot of people know how to think about that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is.
There's a crystal ball in front of you, Matt. Where do you see this going?
I don't typically like to do those sorts of things because obviously I can give scenario. I like the future is so underdefined.
Okay, give me scenarios then.
Well, it's difficult to put the genie back in the bottle after what's happened with the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. I would say overall the worst case scenario would be that fools remain fools and not see how they're being played and run headlong into something that would provoke a thermonuclear exchange that would escalate quite fast and would put all of humanity through the biggest shock therapy, those who survived, than we've ever imagined. And that would make us very pliable and accepting of whatever was put onto us to restore order and allow for our kids to be fed once again after a period of prolonged suffering and chaos, out of which that dream of the age of Horus would emerge. Palantir being also something that emerged out of the total information awareness program that had the all-seeing eye of Horus as its model, its emblem. And in 3, when the neocons around Richard Pearl and John Poindexter created the total information awareness as a mass surveillance dragnet, and that didn't work. But basically, its entire MO and functions were given over to a cardboard cutout by the name of Peter Thiel, and who created his Palantir, as sort of the orb through which you can see everything and have the power of omniscience as God in Lord of the Rings. And that Oracle AI of Larry Ellison and company also emerged out of the CIA. That was his first contract in the 1970s, which had an Oracle program that Larry Ellison was commissioned to carry out in 1978. And that was given a rebranded name along with Stargate, another program run by the CIA and remote viewers in the 1970s. That was then revamped in our more current age under Trump 2.0. So again, that would be just a terrible orientation. The positive orientation would be that there would be a possibility that some kind of a peace plan, there has to be, it has to be somehow. If it's not going to escalate, you have to find a way to stop this war somehow now, before the supply chains completely are severed to the point that they can't be rebuilt of energy, of other vital resources that provide for both our energy, but also our food productive needs to sustain 8 billion lives. That has to be preserved. There's a small window that's getting smaller to preserve and to rehabilitate that. That would involve Russia, China, India also getting its act together. India has to get smarter and really make a decision, because it's playing in both worlds, multipolar as well as is pro-Israel right now, very dangerous. That's risking also another war being launched between the Indians and the Muslims of Pakistan and the Muslims more broadly. So
how much do you think of, I apologize for jumping in.
Sure.
How much of that do you think is organic?
Well, I think it's all I think you have fire starters behind the scenes, but the problem is India has a similar problem as Israel and the Arabs living in that area, because India also, under the BJP party, have revived something that looks a lot like an Indian version of Jewish Zionism in a type. And I'm not saying Modi thinks like this, but there's a lot of people around Modi who do think like this, and who have selected to build one of the most this grand temple to Ram that was inaugurated just 2 years ago on a site that had formerly been for 500 years one of the most holy sites for Muslims in India. And that mosque that was such a holy site was torn down by controlled riots of Hindus, 1992, and 2,000 Muslims were killed in these riots. And at that very demolished site that is the exact place where this Hindu temple to Ram was rebuilt and inaugurated just a couple of years ago as a big multi-generational slap on the face of the Muslims living in the entire region. And the Muslims of Pakistan are certainly not happy. Modi as well did make some bad decisions, whether it was on his own volition or not. He did go to Israel 2 days before or actually a day. He was there for 2 days, and the day he left was the day that the attacks on Iran began. And he had called for reviving the India-Israel relationship or building it afresh upon the India-Israel-European Middle East Economic Corridor, the IMEEC, India Middle East Economic Corridor, that passes through Israel, and that completely bypasses the new Silk Road. It's being sold as an alternative to the China-led New Silk Road, and it would pass through Saudi Arabia, some Gulf states, and then through Israel into Europe. And that is something that Modi seems to really believe should happen, along with a new NATO of the Middle East that is the I2J2 program, or what Netanyahu called the Hexagon Alliance. That would involve some Gulf states. Cyprus would be also involved. Some friendly Gulf states would be involved. And India and Israel would both be involved in this sort of NATO-like structure that some would like to see formed between in the Middle East. So India is really playing such a dangerous game right now by being indecisive and threatening the BRICS. It's threatening the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as is the UAE, of another member, a new member of the BRICS, which is also threatening the viability of a healthy multipolarity. So yeah, I'm not happy with India right now in any way.
Okay, Matt, our conversation is based on your article, which can be found on your Substack. If I don't know where to go, how can I find your work?
The Substack is a good place to begin, which is matthewehret.substack.com. Of course, there's also a couple of websites where people can get the documentaries. My wife and I have launched a production studio over the past couple of years, which has produced a lot of films, big and small alike. And those films are mostly freely available on CanadianPatriot.org, as well as our books that we publish. And finally, RisingTideFoundation.net, which my wife and I set up in 2019. Cynthia Chung is the president, and some of the Rising Tide films and the regular events that we host are available on RisingTideFoundation.org.
As always, Matthew Ehret, thank you for joining me in the trenches.